Welcome to Someone Talks, the official podcast of the National D-Day Memorial, where leading experts spill all the secrets of the Second World War. With your host, Dr. John C. McManus.
Greetings. Welcome to Someone Talked. I'm your host, Dr. John C. McManus from Missouri S&T. Alongside, as always, are my good dear friends from the National D-Day Memorial Foundation, April Cheek-Messier and John Long. Wonderful people. How are you today, folks?
Oh, ready to be inspired today because it's an inspiring story we're going to hear.
Great story, an important one. Mm-hmm. I think our listeners will greatly appreciate this book and the story that inspires it.
Oh, for sure. I mean, you talk about personal stories and brought to the historical context. So our guest today is just a remarkable person, Nina Willner. And I just want to give you a little background on how I came into your work. I know it'll shock everybody that to hear that I love bookstores and love going to look at books and just constantly reading all sorts of different books. And so I don't recall the one this was, but sometime in the recent past, I was in the bookstore looking around for, just new stuff to read. And I came across 40 Autumns, which is Nina Willner's first book, and amazing book about, post-war Germany, obviously the division of Germany and how one family was so deeply affected. And in fact, it's her family. So that's Nina's first book. Of course, our topic today is her second book called The Boys in the Light. More on that in a moment. But just by way of background, of course, Nina, as you'll see as our conversation unfolds, is a product of all this history. And that's partially what so fascinates me about her work is you see kind of the family and personal story affected by these great historical events that we're all a product of, but especially Nina. She herself is a veteran of the United States Army, was an intel officer in the 1980s, stationed where else but Germany, and doing missions, to East Berlin and I think elsewhere on the sort of the other side of the so-called curtain. So, Nina, it's just so exciting to have you here with us today. Thanks for joining us.
Thank you for having me.
Yeah, so we congrats, by the way, on your new book. It's called The Boys in the Light, the extraordinary World War II story of survival, faith, and brotherhood. And of course, as you'll see as our conversation unfolds, this too is a very personal story because it's about Nina's father and others. But so I guess to begin our conversation, obviously a very personal story to tell. How do you decide to make this a book? Where does all this come from?
Yeah, well, so when I wrote my first book, 40 Autumns, that you mentioned, about my mother's story escaping from East Germany, I had mentioned my father being a Holocaust survivor very briefly. And I got a lot of response saying, well, we'd like to hear that story. Mm. So my father's story is extraordinary in and of itself as an Auschwitz and Buchenwald survivor, as a boy in Auschwitz and Buchenwald. But it wasn't until I met the boys of Company D of the 3rd Armored Division, 32nd Armored Regiment, that I realized there was much more to this story that needed to be told. And so I spent 5 years researching, sitting in archives, interviewing the main players in this story, going to all the places in the book, the battlefields, the camps, the hometowns, an incredible story unfolded. So I thought it would make a great book.
Yeah, clearly. I mean, but it seemed to me in reading the book, it goes even deeper than that this story is sort of the product of a lot of family lore, that stories your father had told you, people he had mentioned. I mean, it's really, there's such a long background of this was the way I sensed it, at least.
Oh, absolutely. There's so much to the story. I mean, we can't cover it in just, one sitting. But you'll see how that story unfolds if you haven't read the book already. But there's a lot to pack in there. And yeah, my father did tell us all the stories as we were growing up. And then, of course, we met the boys at Company D later. A lot to it. And just an incredible story.
Well, Nina, let's talk about it a little bit because you tell parallel stories in this book which don't converge for about 200 pages, and it's fascinating, by the way. Just absolutely love this book, so inspiring. But let's start with the Willner family, and I'm going to butcher this name, but it's I guess Mönchengladbach in Germany. MG.
pretty
I
close.
like it in the book. It says MG for short.
MG works fine.
That works good. But we with the Willner family, we see this, total collapse of their world, and you describe it so beautifully throughout the book about just how this happens and what's happening. So, tell us a little bit about the family and what life was like in the pre-war years. Let's maybe start there.
Sure. So, the Willner family lived in Mönchengladbach, MG, which is in northwestern Germany near Cologne. They had lived there for 7 generations. And they originally moved there because of the region's openness, their liberal attitudes and inclusiveness towards Jews. Mönchengladbach was a mid-sized commercial center for the textile industry, something like 1% Jews. And those Jews, including my relatives, were fully assimilated. In the mid 1800s, German law gave Jews full legal rights as citizens. So by the 1930s, Jews were pretty much experiencing little systematic anti-Semitism. And in Mönchengladbach, certainly the Willners were well liked. They were living a comfortable middle-class life, thriving, totally felt part of the community, living among their neighbors in a very integrated neighborhood. They lived in an apartment on the 2nd floor. Their best friends, a Catholic family, a man named Fritz and his family, lived in the apartment on the 1st floor. And the two families were very close. On Christmas, Eddie's father, would dress up as Santa Claus wearing the long red robe and a white beard for Fritz's children. And on Hanukkah, Fritz would wear Eddie's father's yarmulke and the same white beard to play the Hanukkah mensch for little Eddie. And so they had a great relationship. And that was, they were very integrated. My father, Eddie, was a little kid in the 1930s, an only child in a pretty large, extended, very tight-knit Jewish family. His father, Siegfried, was a World War I veteran, a proud German patriot, a war hero who had been awarded the Iron Cross for valor and bravery for 4 years, fighting on both the Eastern and Western fronts for Germany. And Eddie's mother, Augusta, was a pianist who played piano for all kinds of community events. And the family was religiously conservative. They didn't keep kosher. They were proud Germans. They felt German and felt very integrated, as I said, very harmonious with other Germans, both Jews and non-Jews. Eddie went to a public German school. He had lots of friends. He was very popular, kind of a class clown, which of course drew his classmates in even more.
Well, obviously things began to change for them as the Nazis come to power. So tell us a little bit about their experience and describe Kristallnacht as it impacted the family.
So in the early 1930s, of course, Hitler and the Nazis come to power. Hitler, of course, blames just about every negative thing that has ever happened in Germany throughout the ages on the Jews and some others, but Jews were the primary target. And so Jews are singled out and tormented. Eddie's father, Siegfried, loses his job as a textile representative. Eddie starts being bullied in school. So his friends go pretty much from thinking he's a pretty great kid to calling him a dirty Jew. So it's pretty devastating. In school, Jewish children have to sit through humiliating instruction where they're shown charts of the faces of Nordic-looking children, and in contrast, the ugly Jew, saying Jews that are, genetically different from normal human beings, calling them parasites, vermin, and even subhuman. And in school, kids are reading books about how dangerous Jews are. They're being, they're being an entire nation, not just kids, but entire nations being exposed to films that demonize the Jew. And kids are playing board games, where the goal is to kick out the Jews, kick the Jews out of the village. So that escalates. Eddie is bullied. Neighbors turn away. Siegfried's old war buddies turn away from him. No one wants to be seen or associated with Jews. In school, the Jewish kids go, they're moved to the back of the classroom, taunted by the other kids, even by their teacher. And eventually, Eddie and all the Jewish kids are kicked out of the German public school. Then in 1935, the Nuremberg laws amp up that hatred, and the Jews are stripped of their rights as citizens. So in November 1938, Kristallnacht, the night of broken glass, explodes throughout Germany, targeting Jews in a very violent attack. Mobs and actually regular citizens as well are smashing storefronts, dragging people out of their homes, arresting people. And Jews go running to get out any way they can.
So how did Kristallnacht affect your family then? Did they have property that was destroyed, or was there, did they land at your doorstep? So what happened there?
Well, they did. And my grandfather, there's that Opa Josef in the story who just loved Eddie. He loved his antics. He loved that he was a class captain. He had a very close relationship with Eddie, my dad. He was kicked out of his house and moved to a senior home where all the elderly Jewish people were assembled before they were deported to camps and murdered. Definitely, my family was moved out of that second-story apartment where they were crammed in across town to an apartment where 4 Jewish families were living in one apartment, an apartment meant for one family. And there were some other things as well, but yeah, they definitely were affected by all of that. And that's it. Yeah.
Mm-hmm. I mean, it's really arresting in a way. It's like, because you can read about this, as we often have, how things change in Germany and Jews shut out of jobs and made pariahs in school and everywhere else. But what I think is so affecting is when you're reading about it, the background in your family, and you just see, they were like anybody else in Germany, and they were doing well, and they were patriotic Germans, especially Siegfried, who had fought very hard for Germany. And then this turn, it's very emotional, I think, for the reader, because you've kind of gotten to know your family in a way, and in that sense, you're kind of experiencing it at a distance of how horrible this could be, So, I mean, this is just me as a reader. I don't know about. I can imagine your own family history.
Well, that's it. And they were your neighbor, the person you worked with, the person the friend you said hello to in the supermarket. These were all people who you liked you and who you had great relationships with. And I think the family, Siegfried and Augusta, Eddie's parents, were stunned, like many Jews were, believe it or not. Even with the rise of Hitler and the Nazis, they were stunned to see how quickly everyone turned on them.
And Nina, you do such a great job too about showing kind of that slow erosion. Oftentimes you think about it as being something that just happened very quickly, and we know that that's not how it happened. It was just this methodical, slow erosion of rights and things. And your book really personalizes it of what that felt like for the family. And, I know I was just very touched. One of my favorite scenes is actually, or that you talk about, is just how difficult it must have been putting little Eddie on a train and sending him, pinning a little note inside his jacket, but doing everything that they can to kind of keep him safe. And so, I mean, just again, super job there. But I know we're going to come back to the family and kind of what happens there. But meanwhile, you also paint this other picture, this generation of American boys who are growing up in much different circumstances. So can you introduce us to Elmer Haviland?
Sure. Yeah. So Elmer Hovland was a first generation American, a boy from a Norwegian family that came to the U.S. in the 1890s from Uppland, Norway, and settled on the remote plains of Minnesota, becoming farmers as part of that wave of 1 million Scandinavian immigrants who came over at that time. Elmer was a very devout young man from a very devout Lutheran family. He was a pretty average kid, actually. He got average grades in high school. He was a very humble kid, by all accounts, from this remote farming community in Kenneth, near Laverne, Minnesota, which had a population of something like 120. And they worked the land. They, again, like I said, they were a very devout family. Elmer's father, Nels, was a man of very few words who raised his kids to be patriotic Americans, to give back to America and back to their community for the blessings and opportunity that they have been given as new immigrants. And so Elmer grew up in a very simple, very Spartan life, sort of, not expecting much and believing that wherever he went in life, the Lord would lead the way.
Well, meanwhile, half a continent away, you introduce us to Sammy DeCola, who's growing up in Boston in a little different circumstances than Elmer. But tell us about Sammy DeCola, or Pepsi, as kind of his inevitable next nickname became.
So Sammy DeCola lived on the opposite side of the country, just outside of Boston in Waltham, Massachusetts, with his very lively, very animated Italian immigrant family who came from Civitaquana, Italy. His father, his father's living his American dream as an owner of one of those American diners, one of those chrome-looking Art Deco silver American diners. So Sammy gets his start in the diner, which is very fast-paced, and eventually the tempo becomes very frenetic. He spends a lot of time hustling at the diner, working the front, then in the kitchen, serving, cooking, and ends up actually graduating from high school a year later than everyone else due to his father's constant need for his help in the diner. So that's Pepsi. And I'll get to how the name developed, I guess, in a bit.
Yeah. Well, how did the name develop, as long as you bring it up?
So his name is Sammy DeCola, but, his GIs are always trying to find a way to make themselves laugh and trying to make each other laugh and to make fun of each other. They all give each other nicknames. And so they think the name Pepsi DeCola suits him better. And so he becomes Pepsi. And, they do that with the other GIs when they meet up later, give them names, Redhead Fred Hedrick, Babyface Vance and names like that. So anyway, Pepsi becomes Pepsi for the rest of the war. And I knew him as Pepsi for my entire life.
Well, it's, interesting of the triumph of the Pepsi brand that he wasn't Coca-Cola, I guess. But but this is so emblematic, Hovland, the embodiment of the kind of Scandinavian Minnesotan with a recent immigrant background, like you said. DeCola also with a recent immigrant background in the Northeast. I mean, it's almost straight out of a 1940s movie in a way, isn't it? I mean, it's such a rich panoply you've created of their backgrounds, Nina, and I had a sense too that you had really delved deeply into those backgrounds. How did that go for you?
Well, I did, and I went to visit the family in Minnesota. They are really farmers from way back, and very humble, stoic people, hardworking, with a lot of backbone, very simple, hardworking, great people, salt of the earth people, just, no ego, just very, very, very wonderful people. So, yeah. And then, Pepsi, a complete opposite almost, just extremely funny, wiry, snarky, cussing a lot. He's a character. He was a character by all accounts throughout the war. Everyone I interviewed who knew him during the war, certainly my father, his family, everyone said, yeah, that was him. He came from this very lively immigrant family. I think I say in the book something like doors slammed, but they loved each other and they, really embraced life. And so, yeah, very, very much a character.
And you can really see that. I think I love how you portray his Boston accent and just the whole. I was very touched by the relationship with his mother, and of course losing her at a very young age, and how that shaped him. But I think certainly created also a strong bond eventually, with his father, who was very proud of him. So it's just a wonderful story that you bring to life there. But let's go back to Europe now. The Willner's story is one of kind of this separation and being reunited and then separated, and then they're moving through Belgium and France, trying to get to the Pyrenees before worse was yet to come. So again, for me, it just shows this complete erosion of normalcy in their lives, trying to save one another. Again, going back to Eddie being on that little train, and then they're reunited. But then it's just this constant. I can't even imagine what that trauma was like in their lives for those years. Can you talk a little bit about that? Summarize that time of what Eddie went through with his parents.
Sure. Yeah. They, after Kristallnacht, Hitler takes his hatred towards the Jews, his campaign against the Jews up another notch. As I said, people are trying to get out of Germany and flee. And initially, Eddie's parents couldn't get out of Germany legally. And if you're not leaving legally, you could be arrested. And they certainly don't have the means to buy their way out of the country. These are middle-class people. And by the way, they couldn't even get their own money out of the bank at this point. So, because Jewish accounts were locked down. But anyway, Eddie's parents have not gotten permission to leave, but they put Eddie, who at this point is 11 or 12, on a train to Belgium to get him out of the country, to be picked up by anyone who could take him in. And he is eventually picked up by an aid society, an aid organization that whisks him off and puts him in with a Belgian family in Brussels or outside of Brussels. Eventually, the parents, Siegfried and Augusta, do get their papers, and they run to find Eddie and find him in that home in outside of Brussels. But then Hitler invades Belgium. The family goes on the run to France. Hitler invades France. The family is eventually caught. And I mean, there are a few things that happen in between. They go, they are in internment camps. They move from one internment camp to another in France. But finally, they are rounded up, sent to the assembly point at Drancy in Paris, and they are put in cattle cars and told by the Nazi authorities that they are going back to Germany, quote, to work.
Yeah. So, I mean, a lot happens in between, and it also, what happens in between tells us a lot about the progression of the Holocaust. I mean, really the whole story does, as we see this get worse and worse from a very good, comfortable life in Germany to, Nuremberg laws, alienation, separation, all these kinds of things, and now actually leaving the country. So here's the first moment where your dad has to really become a very adaptable person. Now living in another country, learning another languages, and he demonstrates tremendous facility with languages, which is amazing. And so they end up, as you mentioned, in an internment camp in France, which is exactly what's going on during the Vichy days now in the wake of the conquest. And in the book, you talk about how. So I guess it's at this point, Eddie and your grandfather, primarily together at that point in the camp, I think, right? And they've developed a relationship with one of their guards, one of the French gendarmes. So here we see the French point of view of some people, acting with some level of kindness and others not. So what was that story, with this kind of bond they had with a guard, and how does that impact, what happens with your father at that point?
So that was, I think you were referring to the time when they were in the Reef Salt camp, and or that might have been Gerst. No, that was Reef Salt, and they were in that camp for a while. It was actually, those camps were a lot worse than people think they were. I mean, there were people who were dying of starvation in those camps. So, and these were just, sort of not even transit, but they were internment camps, and. At one point, so Eddie was with his father. It was a men's only camp. They had been separated from Augusta for a while, and then met back up later. But they were in this camp, and Eddie had made friends. So Eddie's about 14 years old at this point. He had made friends with a gendarme guard who, obviously their job was to ensure that no one escaped. But Eddie picked up French. He had picked up French earlier. And so he would spend the time whenever this guard came on duty to chat with him. And eventually, I think they kind of a very nice little relationship developed. And at one point, I don't want to spoil the scene for you, but at one point, the guard helps them to slip the internment camp and run off into the night.
Well, let's switch back to the U.S. again. We keep crossing the ocean, but your story does that very effectively, I might add. But Elmer and Pepsi and the rest of their buddies become part of Company D, 32nd Armored Regiment, 3rd Armored Division, and are shipped over to Europe. So what sort of officer was Elmer Hovland?
Yeah, Elmer Hovland, Elmer and Sammy DeCola, Pepsi DeCola, come together when they're assigned to, as you said, D Company, 32nd Armored Regiment, 3rd Armored Division. Sammy was assigned as a cook, Elmer Hovland, the farm boy from Minnesota, is told that he's going to be an officer, but he doesn't want to be an officer. And he was just one of the guys back in Kenneth. He just wants to be one of the guys in the Army. He clearly doesn't have the military pedigree to be an officer. Many are either West Point graduates or college graduates, or have at least some college under their belts. He's barely a high school graduate with extremely mediocre grades. And I know this because I looked at his report cards. And Elmer really doesn't want to be in charge at all. In fact, when he entered the Army, he told the recruiters, quote, "I don't want to be an officer." But he's not given a choice. He's become an armor officer. He becomes an armor officer, a leader of men. And then you'll see that he, when you read the book, that he's basically thrust into the spotlight to take the lead in this story.
Yeah, I mean, he's really a natural leader, it seems to me. And I mean, you were an officer too, so I would imagine you could, relate to that sort of like how do I approach this leadership thing? How did that impact how you were looking at Elmer at this point in his career, where he's not really wanting the responsibility, but he has it, and now he has to train his people up for it?
I think when you read the book, you'll see that it really came, he was raised with all these good such great character, and maybe he didn't even realize it at the time, but with leadership characteristics, he was humble. He didn't have an ego. He cared about people. And he was also brought up with this sort of code of morality in his family growing up. And his parents really instilled in him that the group is always more important than the individual standing alone. So I think he took all of that. As I said, Nels, his father, the most important thing to him was that you were humble, you stayed humble, and that you had a backbone, you had skills, and that you worked hard, and high moral character. So I think he didn't even know he had it in him. When he went off to war, as I said, he just wanted to be one of the guys. He did not want to stand out in any way. And I think, as you'll see in the book, if you haven't read it, he just he just sort of anneals to that role because he has to, because no one else is. As you know, the story about the company commander who doesn't quite pan out. So somebody has to step up, and it ends up being Elmer.
Nina, Augusta Willner, I love reading about her. She seemed like such a very, very strong woman who had to endure all of this. She's separated from her husband and son, and she meets this unspeakable fate in the gas chamber at Auschwitz. So obviously this book is one way, I think, that you have beautifully memorialized and honored her. But how has your family honored her memory and the millions like her?
Well, that's a great question. Thanks for asking that question. Yeah, I mean, that's a very sad part of the story because that's my grandmother. And if you haven't read the book, I will let you read that for yourself. But I do kind of take you through that whole scene about what happened to my grandmother, Augusta, and what happened to, most of the women and children and the elderly in that transport. Augusta, my grandmother, was 42 years old in the prime of her life, full of passion, full of joy, with dreams of watching her son grow up. It's a very sad story that would be told 1,000,000 times over. And ultimately she would become one of the more than 1,000,000 human beings, who would be murdered at 6,000 lives a day in Hitler's attempt to wipe European Jews off the face of the earth in this systematic murders in Auschwitz-Birkenau. And of course, 6 million Jews overall killed in the Holocaust. But to answer your specific question, about how we honor their memories, I open the book with a quote from the Talmud that says, "A person is only forgotten when his or her name is forgotten." So it's common practice in the Jewish religion, this practice of active remembrance, to keep history and heritage alive and to keep the memories and legacies alive of people who have passed. In our family, we remember those people, who those people were in life, and we find ways to keep them close. For example, my middle name is Augusta. My sister's middle names are also Augusta, and the 3 boys in my family have the same middle name, Siegfried.
I mean, so we've seen, how it's gotten to this point. And so where your dad and your grandfather are and about to be, deported east. And of course, your grandmother. And so I have an author question. And I just think it's very, very poignant, the passage where you're describing what happens to your grandmother. And you talk about her talents and who she was. And like you said, 42 years old. Prime of life. I mean, think about it from our perspective now, how young that is. How do you, as an author, most of the time we're writing about people we don't know or don't know as well, right? This is your grandmother. How did you approach that emotionally and in an attempt to tell that story? And you're telling it to your family too, how did you go about that?
So I grew up with these stories. Of course, I had to do a lot of research to find out exactly what happened to her and how. Excuse me. But it was very tough to dig down deep and actually, once you find out exact truth, and I had to go back to those places and to archives, and I sat with a researcher in Auschwitz-Birkenau to find out exactly what happened to her and how and what day and all of that. It's just a very difficult process, as you can imagine, to be, again, your grandmother. This is, your father's mother. And just that whole thing was very difficult. I will say I was brought up with the stories, raised with the stories. So it wasn't a brand new concept to me about what had happened to her and how. But of course, the details I found out later. And I think the thing that really drove me to tell this part of the story so intimately is that I think we forget when we hear stories of genocide, or trauma or murder, we forget that these were real people that and in this case, there were millions of them who were real people who had full lives, who walked unsuspectingly towards their deaths. They didn't even know that what was they were being told. They were told they were going to work, or they had, the next station they would, the registrars would need to find out what their skills were so they could be properly placed for work and so on. And so it was unsuspecting. And so for me, I think the driving force to tell this story so intimately was that we have to remember that how it happened, what happened, and these were human beings like you and I that were marched to their deaths. It's very important that we know those details to sort of fully understand that those were living, thriving human beings like you and me.
And let me let our audience know that this book, I picked it up thinking, I got to read this for the podcast, how to get started. I couldn't put it down. I finished it in basically a weekend because it's just such a compelling story. But moving on with the narrative, we have now Siegfried and Eddie, who don't go to the gas chambers largely because they can work. So tell us about their experience in the labor camps.
Right. So their first encounter with the Nazi SS, Eddie and Siegfried undergo what would become the first of many selections in an almost, constant life and death process to determine their fate. So in this selection process, you're determined to either be fit to work or unfit and removed from the ranks and sent to the gas chambers or shot. It's as simple as that. So in their first selection, Eddie and Siegfried are chosen to live another day. And going forward, this weeding out process will happen on average twice a day. And the point is, of course, to get rid of those who are injured or too weak looking to work slave labor, and the SS feel that they can't be of use to the work effort. So at 16, Eddie was one of the youngest chosen to make it through this initial selection because the cutoff age for fit workers was 16. So he's 16, and at the age of 48, Siegfried was one of the oldest in the group where the cutoff age was 50. So age-wise, they both just barely make that cut. And, apparently they look strong enough to make that first cut. So they become slave labor and go to their first camp.
Well, yeah, I mean, it's powerful. And it's around this time, then they also introduced to someone very special that they get to know was Moritz Mike Schwab. I hope I'm saying his name correctly, but he now enters your family's story. Can you tell us a little bit about Mike?
Sure. Mike Schwab. Mike Schwab is a Dutch Jewish teenager from Amsterdam. Mike and his family had lived in the Jewish quarter just down the street, actually across the canal from Anne Frank's home, where she was hiding. And Mike's family had already been murdered when he arrives in the camp system as an orphan. And the Dutch Jewish kid Mike and the German Jewish kid Eddie, both around the same age as 16, become fast friends. As you'll see in the story, they become inseparable. And they so they're tattooed with numbers on their arms. My dad, Eddie, with the number A5662, Mike with the number A5636. Their heads are shaved. They're given blue and white striped uniforms, which barely fit them, by the way. They hang loose on their frames because they are uniforms for grown men. And it's really quite the journey they go on as young teens, trying to stay strong, trying constantly to look strong, and trying to keep up in a man's world in this labor concentration camp. And eventually they become the key to each other's survival.
Yeah, so I mean, this is, as much as anything, this is a leadership story too. So here's a situation where your father, Eddie, and now his very, very close friend Mike, are together with, of course, your grandfather, Siegfried, who has to set an example for the Boyds, but is in a really, really tough spot. I mean, having to work as a slave laborer, again, I think, like you said, Nina, sometimes it's easy to look past the humanity of this when we're talking about the gas chambers and just, people being trained in and dying in droves and whatever. But I mean, also slave laborers, what that meant in terms of hard labor for all daylight hours and more, and very little food, probably, what do you think? Maybe about 1,000 plus calories if you're lucky. I mean, just doing this day by day, and as a guy pushing 50, your grandfather then has to kind of set this example.
Right. Yeah. So, and he was, he was a very, he'd been through some things in the World War I, but when they land in Auschwitz, sub camp Blechhammer, it's a forced labor camp in the Auschwitz system, an oil refinery, where in some cases where slave labor is working, and also POWs, Allied POWs. But in this camp, it's a very difficult. It's a struggle to stay alive, as you said. Very little to eat. Not enough for hard labor. And so Siegfried, takes it upon himself to draw on his military background, his experiences in combat in World War I. And he does everything in his power to try to keep the boys alive, to mentally and physically. And he also tries to keep them sane. He tries to teach them the ropes of survival. As I said, he was a pretty hardcore soldier and had been through some things, and he knows how to stay alive in as much as you can stay alive in a concentration camp, Auschwitz concentration camp. So he teaches them about personal discipline, and there's a whole story there about how he raises his son to have a lot of discipline, but in the camps, he's still disciplining his son, and now Mike, he takes Mike under his wing, and simply tells them things like, we can do hunger. Or, you're stronger than you think you are. And they believe him, and they sort of follow his lead. So, he ends up playing a critical role in their survival.
Yeah, clearly. I mean, that comes through. So we're running out of time for this episode, but just to kind of put a bow on it, I really think it's interesting, that link between your grandfather's combat experiences in World War I and now how he comports himself in World War II. The irony of the whole thing, of course, here he fought for Germany so hard in World War I, was a highly decorated veteran. So he's learned all this and been inculcated with all this military discipline that is now quite helpful to him. And he was also raising his kids that way. I mean, if I remember correctly, Eddie would often, before all this, would stand at attention, when he addressed his father. And so now here they are in this horrendous setting, and yet military discipline now plays a key role. Did that, in terms of finding that out, did that come through your father and Mike telling you this in detail? And of course, they're eventually going to be military experience too. Is that how this, you were able to bring this to light?
Yeah, absolutely. It came from Eddie and Mike. And Eddie, there's that whole story. Again, I don't want to spoil that for you, but where Eddie was this class clown, his father basically noticed that, realized the winds of change were changing. The winds of change were changing in Germany, and sort of had this foresight. I mean, as a father, he was probably that way anyway. But he wanted to get his son. I think he understood the value of discipline, and so he worked on his son as he was growing up, and then he continued that in the camps. He understood that would be an asset to the boys.
Yeah, and it clearly was. So the just a reminder, the book is called The Boys in the Light, an extraordinary World War II story of survival, faith, and brotherhood by Nina Willner. Amazing story. And then, of course, we'll leave it at this point. We're about halfway through the story, and it's about to get way more remarkable that we will cover in the next episode. In the meantime, John Long, please tell us about today's We Salute You.
Today on our We Salute You segment, we honor two brave airmen who died together and who were symbolically reunited at the National D-Day Memorial this past June 6th. In September 1915, William Robert Roycraft was born in Douglas County, Wisconsin. About a year and a half later, Martin Robert Schumacher was born in East Dundee, Illinois. Growing up, Midwestern boys during the Roaring '20s and then the Great Depression, these two young men could not have imagined the epic global conflict that would soon bring them together, much less that they would die side by side, serving their nation on the same day, June 6, 1944. In early January 1942, only a few weeks after Pearl Harbor, Martin Schumacher enlisted in the U.S. Army Air Force, not waiting for his number to be called in the draft. Over ensuing months, he trained as a crew chief for a C-47, the workhorse transport for the paratroopers, which would contribute so much to victory in the war. Meanwhile, William Roycraft also joined the Army Air Force in August of 1942. He was soon selected as an aviation cadet to undergo pilot training for C-47s. He was certified as a pilot, commissioned as an officer, and before he shipped overseas, like so many other young American servicemen, he got married to Beth Adams of Mankato, Minnesota. Overseas, Lieutenant Roycraft flew for the campaigns in North Africa and Sicily. It is unclear exactly when Tech Sergeant Martin Schumacher joined his crew, but certainly by the time the planes and airmen of the 49th Troop Carrier Squadron were training in England for the coming cross-channel invasion, the men were together, along with crewmen Robert Shipley, the co-pilot, Walter Romney, the navigator, and Roy Geyer, the radio operator. On D-Day, June 6, 1944, this intrepid crew was to drop paratroopers from the 508th Parachute Infantry Regiment, 82nd Division, in the vicinity of Saint-Mère-Église. While they began encountering anti-aircraft fire as soon as they crossed the French coast, the plane made it to their target. However, they missed their exact drop zone. Roycraft made a courageous decision. He circled back to make a second approach and tried to deliver his warriors exactly on target. This risky maneuver got his paratroopers where they were supposed to be. The last troopers to see the plane reported that it was still under fire, but was last seen safely heading back to the coastline. However, the C-47 would not make it. On the western edge of the Cherbourg Peninsula, the plane spun into the ground, no doubt finally succumbing to enemy anti-aircraft fire. By all indications, there were no survivors. However, knowing exactly what happened to each of the men aboard was an impossible task in the chaos of war. The men were initially reported as missing in action on June 6th. Over ensuing weeks, 3 men, Shipley, Romney, and Geyer, were declared dead and assigned the obvious death date of June 6th. Roycraft and Schumacher, however, were also found later, and their remains were buried, with June 6th initially listed as their death date. But by early September, the death date for these 2 brave airmen was changed without explanation to June 15th, perhaps the date their remains were recovered. For many years, 3 men from this valiant crew have been named on our wall at the National D-Day Memorial. Roycraft and Schumacher were not included, even though there was no evidence they had survived the initial crash of their plane. However, research into their story over the past 2 years, while not conclusive beyond all possible doubt, indicates that it is far more likely than not that these 2 men also perished on June 6th alongside their 3 crewmates. Therefore, their names have been added to our wall and to our necrology database to honor their valor, fidelity, and sacrifice. The courage, devotion to duty, and skill in battle of this crew, now reunited at the National D-Day Memorial, was emblematic of all of the Allied forces on D-Day. Nina earlier quoted a Talmudic proverb, "A person is only forgotten when his name is forgotten." By adding their names to our memorial wall, we proclaim that they will always be remembered. Lieutenant William Roycraft and Tech Sergeant Martin Schumacher, we salute you. Thank you for your service, even unto death, and thank you for doing your part to save the world.
It really brings to mind the importance of the necrology project.
Yes. It's always very emotional. Every time we add another name, you think about their families. It's very moving. So glad to have them included.
Absolutely. And it's often difficult research because, again, keeping the records perfectly, that was not their priority in 1944. They had, something else on their mind. There was a world war going on. So
inconsiderate.
It's interesting and frustrating sometimes, but always compelling to go through these records and try to determine exactly when a man died. And, often there are competing death dates, and you have to kind of just make the best case you can and pull the evidence together. And for these two, we finally decided it just did not seem very likely that 2 men survived that crash and 3 men died. So the death dates are uncertain in the records, but I feel confident they belong on our wall.
Absolutely.
Yeah, the circumstances lead to that.
Yeah.
Not much else makes much sense. Wow. Well, thanks for sharing that, and again, thanks again to our guest Nina Willner, author of The Boys in the Light, and we look forward to talking to you in the next episode. Thanks, Nina.
Thank you so much.
Well, you can email our team at podcast@dday.org. Again, that's podcast@dday.org. If you're enjoying our discussions on World War II and its lasting impact, please subscribe to this podcast, share it with your friends, rate it, leave us a review. We love to hear from you. Help us share the lessons and legacies of D-Day and World War II. Thanks, everybody, for joining us. Take care.
Someone Talked is a production of the National D-Day Memorial Foundation, recorded at Media Squatch in Bedford, Virginia. The views expressed are not necessarily those of the foundation, studio, or sponsors. Promotional consideration for Someone Talked is provided by Framatome, an international leader in nuclear energy. Learn more at framatome.com. Explore the National D-Day Memorial, plan your visit, and learn more about our educational programming and upcoming events at dday.org. Join the conversation. Email our team at podcast@dday.org. So long from all of us at Someone Talked.